So today I thought we would go over theory and critiques, which is probably something you haven't thought about. So normally when we debate, it's just like substance debate, which just means that we're debating about the actual topic, right? So you're like, okay, here's my contention, here's why I support this topic or why I don't support this topic. Theory and critiques are kind of like debating about debate itself, either like the rules of debate that should exist or like why some arguments are bad. So, or like debating about the arguments themselves and not necessarily like, oh, your link is wrong, but rather like your argument in and of itself, like you're making this argument and it's actually like really bad for XYZ reasons. And we'll get into that. So, first, theory is usually about the practices we do in debate. Sometimes it's about in round rhetoric or like what you say in round, but more often in round practices, which is like the things you do in round as opposed to like the things you say in round. So, for example, something that you could run theory about is there's like something called you guys theory. So, like, usually when you go into a room, you'll like greet the other debaters and like the judge's like, oh, how are you guys doing, right? And the argument that people make is that saying how are you guys doing is bad because like if it was all guys it would probably be okay, but like there's some people who are like girls in there, like some people who identify differently, so the argument is that by saying like you guys we perpetuate this idea that like is harmful, right? Because you don't see people like walking into a room of men and they're like, hey, you girls, right? It's always like you guys, even if everyone is a girl there. So like the idea is that like we have this like male centric mindset and we shouldn't say you guys because that's bad. So it's like things like that. There's also like, oh, you shouldn't run like extinction debates, or you shouldn't like when you're cutting your evidence, you should like link it, or you should do XYZ, right? So it's about like the things that you do in debate, or like, oh, my opponent shouldn't paraphrase in debate, things like that. And it's only about debate, and it's very structured, and it usually always looks the same. So there's either a paragraph way, which is like easier for lay judges, like parent judges, to understand, or there's like a shell, which is usually the way that you want it to be. And we just call like, so like how we call arguments about the topic contentions, we call arguments about theory, we call them shells, right? So each like argument about theory is called a shell, so you can have many different shells, and that's just how you structure it. Yeah. And usually when we debate theory, the argument is generally that you should always vote for who wins theory over vote for who wins the actual debate. So for example, you can have both debates at once, right? Usually in most debates, they'll talk about the theory, they'll spend some time on it, and then they'll also spend 2 minutes on the actual substance of the debate. So instead of just debating about the rules, they'll also be debating about the topic. But the general consensus or the way that people run theory is that theory should be voted on first over substance. So even if you lose like the debate on the topic, right? Let's say it's like the drug topic, like should we legalize all drugs or not? Even if I lose the debate on whether or not we should legalize drugs, if I win the theory debate, I generally will win the entire debate, because the argument is that like, okay, if we follow some sort of rules in debate but you broke the rules, then even if you won like the overall debate, right, it doesn't make any sense because you basically like cheated or you broke the rules to get your way there. So that's why if you win theory you can win the entire round. So like, does the concept of theory make sense so far? Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. Can you say that again?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, hi, Tyler. You joined us. That's very fun. Um, okay. So the next is critiques. So here's a vague definition. It's a philosophical argument that challenges an assumption made or the mindset of an opponent. So critiques can be a lot of things. And like, whereas theory is only about like the rules and debate and what you're doing in the debate, critiques can be a lot of different things. Like it can also be about like the substance of what you say in the debate, right? So like it's like it can be a critique of the argument that you're running. So for example, there's a critique called cap K, which is capitalism critique, which is a critique of capitalism. And basically this is used a lot. For example, like um if we think about like the current topic that they're talking about, right? Like the US should trade with Taiwan and they should make a trade agreement. Um that's like capitalism, right? Because it's like talking about like the free market, like lifting trade barriers. And then the argument is that like capitalism in and of itself is bad for XYZ reasons. So the fact that you're like arguing for a trade agreement that would support capitalism is bad, right? Even if the trade agreement like brings a lot of benefits, you're arguing for capitalism, and that's a bad thing, right? It can also be there are identity Ks, which are like, I should win today's debate because, oh, I see you, William. You just joined us, but we're just talking about like theory and critiques today. But identity Ks are like, I should win today's debate because of my identity. For example, one really popular one, or like one of the more famous ones is there are a lot of Black people who run Ks and they say, okay, you should vote me up in today's round for XYZ reasons, right? So there's this really powerful K that they read once that was like, um, what happened was originally there's only policy debate, and then after that it branched off into LD and PF debate, right? And PF debate is like the one that we have that we're talking about right now, where there's mostly like you're supposed to try and appeal to the public, so you're supposed to speak slowly, you're supposed to like, you know, use like don't use big words, and like don't make it really complicated, but you're instead supposed to appeal to the general person. So you generally shouldn't be running theory or Ks in public forum debate, right? So what they said is that, okay, so all the debaters who didn't want to deal with identity Ks that say you should vote for Black people, because they just moved into public forum because they know that like parents wouldn't understand. The parents would be like, okay, why would I vote for you just because you're like a certain, you identify a certain way, right? So that's why they created public forum debate. So the argument is that public forum debate is actually really racist to Black people because it was created just to avoid them being able to like make these identity Ks. But other than that, there's also like reasons like historically we've seen that like there's less people of color who are in like national tournaments in the out rounds and the elimination rounds and who go really far, and just like not being able to see people who are like you, like who are the same color as you in these out rounds makes you feel like, you know, like I don't have, like I can't be that good, like why am I in debate, right? There's no, it's all like white people who are winning. So the idea is that when you vote me up and I go further and further, I can be an example to other Black people that yes, we can like have success in debate, and then that incentivizes more people to come into debate. So there are a lot of identity based Ks like that. It's not only for like Black people, it can be for like LGBTQ plus people, or you know, people who identify in different ways. But it's like, vote for me because voting for me and giving me success shows to other people who are like me that they can also be successful. um yeah, so that's identity of a like critique. There's, you know, you can think of it as a lot of different arguments to help you win the round. It can be either about the argument that your opponent made, or just, you know, about yourself, or even something that your opponent has done. Okay, so does anyone have any questions on like what a critique is or what theory is? Oh, we're not gonna play this Jeopardy. Okay, so it makes sense. And let's, okay. Takeaway. So there's some arguments that can be run either as theory or critique. The distinction isn't always like super clear, but generally you want to think of theory as debates about the rules of debate, and critique is debate about other things in the debate. Okay, so here's the structure of a theory. So much like we call, right, debate arguments contentions when we're talking about the topic, when we're talking about the rules of debate, we call them shells, right? And just like a contention, each shell has many parts. So in your contention, you have like your claim, uniqueness, link, and your impact, right? So the claim of your shell, your theory shell, would be the inter. So this is like your rule that debate should follow, right? It typically has something that either your opponents must do or something they should not do. It's kind of like the resolution of theory debates, right? And it has to be very specific. So the more specific your interpretation is, the better it is. So for example, an interpretation could be debaters must not wear shoes, right? You can make like any rule you want when you're debating theory, but obviously, the more outlandish ones, the judges probably would be like, okay, well, why do I care about that? For example, if you say like, oh, debaters uh must not smile during debate, like unless you can come up with some good reasons, the judge probably wouldn't vote for you, right? But you can make any argument you do want to make in a theory show. So these are some examples of bad interps, right? The bad rules. So for example, debaters must not spread. Debaters must not read disads in second rebuttal. Debaters must not read disclosure theory on small schools. So the problem that you see with these is that it's very like not specific, right? So spreading, it just means speaking really fast. So when should debaters not spread? Like they can't even practice spreading at home, like, right? So it's like very unspecific. And um what happens is it's the same with contentions, right? When you debate contentions, other people are refuting your arguments. They're saying, oh, your argument is wrong for XYZ reasons. The same way this happens for theory, right? The opponent is saying, okay, your shell is bad for XYZ reasons. And one of the places that is very commonly attacked is the interps, right? A lot of interps are very like vague. So for example, it says debaters must not spread, right? Somebody could be like, okay, we don't know where, it doesn't say like debaters must not spread at a tournament. So I'm spreading at a tournament. I won't spread in other times. So technically, I haven't violated the rule. So they can find either loopholes in the rules that are very vague, or they can say, okay, your interp is like really bad. We should look at it because it's like so vague, right? So here are some good interps that you would want. So interpretation. For each tournament, debaters must disclose all previously read constructive positions on the 2019 to 2020 NDCA PF Wiki at least 30 minutes before their next round. Disclosure must include tag sites and the full text of the card. So disclosure just means telling people what your argument is. So there's this website that's really great. Policy had it first, but basically it's called NDCA PF Wiki, and it's where everyone doesn't have to do it. It's where a lot of people post their cases, right? So disclosing just means revealing what you're going to read or what you have already read before. So disclosure, for example, if I were to disclose, right, let's say I had a case and I ran it last week at a tournament, I would put like contention 1, this is why I ran, this is the evidence I used. Contention 2, this is why I ran, this is the evidence I used. So when other people, are like researching or they're about to like go against me in the future, they would look at that wiki and they'd be like, okay, so in the past, Nicole has talked about these contentions. Maybe she's going to continue to do that in the future, right? So disclosing just means telling other people what your argument is. So a bad interp, right, would be debaters must disclose, right? So if let's say I'm trying to run that like everyone should tell each other what their arguments are before the round, right? And my interp is just debaters must disclose. Well, my opponents can be like, okay, well, you didn't say when I have to disclose. I'll disclose after this round, right? And technically, they haven't violated my interpretation because it's not specific enough. But when I say debaters must disclose at least 30 minutes before their next round, that tells them, okay, well, you didn't disclose 30 minutes before the round. You can't just disclose after the round. So the more specific you can get, the more you avoid like your opponents just like getting through a loophole and saying, okay, I didn't violate your rule. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So the second part of the debate is a violation. And this is like the impact kind of. You can kind of say it's the impact. It's just how they broke your rule, right? So whereas in a contention, you're arguing whether something is good or bad. In an interp, you're arguing whether something is good or bad, but you also have to prove that your opponents broke your rule, right? Or else there's no point. Like, yeah, we can debate about like the rules all you want, but if they didn't break the rule, there's no like impact on the round, right? So you have to prove how they violated your interp. It needs to be verifiable, so you can't just like say that it happened and then it happened, right? And you also should not violate your own show. So for example, if you say like, okay, everyone should disclose 30 minutes before the round, and your opponents haven't disclosed, but you also haven't disclosed, if your opponents find that out, like that's like really bad, right? Like if you're like, okay, debaters shouldn't smile during round, and then you smile, then it's like, okay, well, you're violating your own rule, so it kind of like, evens it out. So there's no reason to vote against your opponent or vote against you. So for example, for the interp that says debaters shouldn't wear shoes, you would say, okay, they're wearing shoes. You can just look at their feet. It's very verifiable, right? A bad violation would be something that you say they did. For example, oh, I saw them like being mean to someone else. Like that's very unverifiable, unless like you brought the person who they were bullying with you into the round. Then that would be a good example that you can verify, right? Another thing is like, oh, they said that they would not do XYZ, but you don't have like a recording of it, you don't have like a screenshot of it, you don't have any proof. Like just because you say they did something doesn't necessarily mean they did something, right? So your opponents could just be like, oh, I didn't violate the rule, like I've never done that, like I don't know what you're talking about, and then obviously you wouldn't get your interp, right? A good violation would be, here's a screenshot of them not disclosing on the wiki. So like I said, the wiki is where people like put the information on what like arguments they ran before, which just ran just means like they used before in a tournament, right? So here's this website. I went to like their name, their team name, and then I like looked on their website and there's nothing there, and then you take a screenshot and then you show the judge, you're like, look, they didn't disclose. That's hard evidence, right? It's like very clear. So that's a violation, right? So you have the interp, which is you state the rule, you state their violation, which is they broke this rule, here's evidence. And then the third thing is standards. So these are kind of like the links in theory debate and kind of, right? So this is the reason why your theory shell is good for debate. And it's very open-ended, but in general, this is where most theory debates happen. So for example, when you're running, like, let's say we're arguing about whether or not to legalize all drugs, right? You can say, yeah, we should legalize drugs. But what are the reasons? Okay, legalizing drugs would decrease people in prison. It would let people to get jobs. It would allow people to access treatment because they're not scared of like going to jail instead of getting treatment, right? So what this does is it's explaining why your rule actually is good, right? You can have any interpretation you want, but if it doesn't make any sense, why would anyone vote for your rule, right? So you're telling them why this is good. So generally, they're kind of written in like sentence form, and you can have evidence for your standards, but because theory is so like, like when we're debating these debate topics, like, oh, should we legalize drugs? Like everyone writes articles about that, right? Like there's hard evidence for yes or no. Like when you're talking about the rules of debate, nobody really writes articles on like, oh, debate should only be 3 minutes long instead of like 2 minutes long. And you're just like, okay, that doesn't make any sense, right? Nobody's writing articles on that. So generally it's kind of more about logic and what you think it is good for. There is evidence out there that you can find, but generally I would say it's much harder to find that kind of evidence as opposed to finding evidence for like the actual topic, right? So when you think about standards, you mostly think about like the logic behind your reasons. So when we're talking about disclosure, which is telling other people what you're running, like your arguments and what evidence you use, right? One of the standards for disclosure theory could be evidence ethics. So you would read first is evidence ethics. Disclosure means that both sides get half an hour to check cards instead of just 3 minutes, allowing for more in-depth checking of evidence to ensure cards are not misconstrued and increasing evidence ethics. So one big problem in debate is that because we paraphrase, right? So we read a piece of article and we say, oh, this is what the article says. But you never know if your opponents are telling the truth, right? They can just like say anything that the article is saying. So a lot of the time in public forum debate, there's a problem of people lying about their evidence. They say like one thing about their evidence, but the evidence actually says something else, right? So the argument here is that by disclosing and by telling people, okay, these are the websites I use for my like evidence, you can like people can click on these links and they can read it themselves, right? And if you disclose half an hour before your round, people can like read your evidence instead of having to do it during their prep time or like in round, which you only get 3 minutes of prep time, right? So by having 30 minutes instead to like look at your opponent's evidence, you can actually see that like, okay, they're lying about their evidence or they're not. And by creating this time for people to check your evidence, what it does is like it disincentivizes people from lying about their evidence, right? Because like if I know that I'm gonna be found out that I'm lying about my evidence, I probably wouldn't be doing it as much, right? So that's the argument about evidence ethics. Does this make sense to everyone?
Yep.
Can I go to the bathroom?
Sorry, William, what did you say?
Oh, can I go to the bathroom?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. We can just like wait for William for a second. Hopefully he comes back soon. Anyways, how is school for you guys? Are you guys excited? There's only like a month left of school, right?
Yeah.
Nice. Do you guys have finals soon?
I had an SPA testing last week.
Oh, how's that?
It was kind of easy.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Makes sense, makes sense. It's generally like pretty not too bad. I wonder if William is back yet. Okay. I think William will understand if we move on. But okay. So the last part of ish interp shell is, I mean, a theory shell is its voters, right? And the voters are basically like the impacts in a contention. So why do your standards matter? So when we think about like evidence ethics, right? Like, sure, it's good to not lie about your evidence, but like, why does it actually matter at the end of the day? What is the impact on debaters, right? When we think about like debate, we're thinking like, okay, sure, economic growth is good, but how does that actually impact the person, right? That's the same idea here. Voters are like, how does this implicate onto the debater and the round itself? Um, so for example, when we talk about evidence ethics, you can make the argument that like evidence, for example, you could say evidence ethics are the most important thing to fairness because if my opponents, just lie about uh like they just lie about their evidence, it's unfair to me because I actually have to like find real evidence that is good, whereas they just like make stuff up like it's not even true, right? There's no reason you should vote for them. So it's like completely unfair. And then like so there's two main reasons that people link their standards to. Usually it's just education and fairness, right? So um education is another one. So like evidence ethics, right? Like if my opponents are lying about their evidence, we don't get any education at the end of the day. Like we're just learning fake things, right? It's misinformation. And then you have to also explain why education and fairness are important to debate. So one common argument for fairness is like, okay, debate is at the end of the day like a game. It's like it should be a fair competition. But if it's unfair and someone always gets an advantage because they're lying about their evidence, people are going to like be disincentivized from joining debate, and people are going to quit debate, which is like bad for debate overall because then like debate will be a dying activity. The second is education. So like something people often say is like the only reason that schools care about debate is because it educates people. It gives you like more knowledge. And then the reason why a lot of people do debate is like the only benefit that you really get from debate is like education, right? You learn how to speak, you learn like things about the topic that you're researching. But if they're having fake evidence, like there's no way that we're learning anything, right? So education and fairness are two big voters that people link it to. Okay, so I don't know what I was thinking when I made this slide. Oh, right. Okay, so standard is different from voter, right? It might be kind of confusing because they both seem like they're impacting debate, but a standard is like, what does violating this rule do to debate? And there's like a lot of different standards, right? Like time skew is a standard, um like depth of debate is a standard, but at the end of the day it all links to the voter, right? So you can think of the voter as why the judge should care about this theory show, right? Like, okay, sure, having bad evidence is bad, but why does it matter? Okay, it's bad for education and fairness, which is the reason that we do debate. If debate wasn't fair, nobody would do it. It would not be fun at all, right? Because someone is always going to win. And if we aren't getting educated, schools won't fund debate, and like there's gonna be like no debate teams left, right? So that's why the judge is like, oh, that's pretty compelling, right? Like zero debate teams, that's pretty bad. Um, but a standard is what stems from the the violation of the rule, right? It's like, okay, when you violate the rule, you have bad evidence ethics, right? When you're not disclosing, or there's a time skew because like my opponents know exactly what I'm going to say, like what I'm going to argue, but I have no idea of what they're going to argue, right? So they're like winning on the amount of time they have to prep out my case, right? They know what I'm gonna say, so they're gonna like research evidence on like why I'm wrong, whereas I can't do that to them, right? So it's kind of like a time skew, or it's also about fairness, um like depth, like the clash of arguments, so how well things clash. So a lot of times like people will just run arguments that like never clash against each other, right, until rebuttal. But like if we know their evidence and what they're running ahead of time, maybe I will find like better evidence that like, or run a different case that actually like directly goes against them. So okay, let's do some practice on what is a standard versus what is a voter. So here's what topic research. Paraphrasing disincentivizes research you can make do with mediocre evidence. This destroys education because debaters are learning less about the topic. And remember, paraphrasing is just like, saying the article said this without actually putting it in quotes and using what the article actually said. So do you guys think this is a standard or a voter?
A voter?
Okay. Does anyone else think it's a standard or a voter?
Is it a standard?
Okay. So if we think about this, what does this say, right? So the interpeer would be debaters shouldn't paraphrase, probably something more specific, right? Like debaters should use quotations of the author instead of paraphrasing. When this says paraphrasing disincentivizes research you can make do with mediocre evidence, this destroys education because debaters are learning less about the topic, right? So when we look at topic research, is topic research a voter for debate, right? Like if you say, oh, you should vote for us because we increase topic research, the judge will probably be like, okay, like why does that matter, right? So this is a standard because it's topic research. It isn't exactly education or fairness or something that makes the judge want to vote, right? But Tyler, you're right in that it does connect to the voter. What you always want to do is connect your standing to the voter, right? Because it talks about education here, and education is the voter, right? Because like education is important for X, Y, Z. But this doesn't specifically say like how. So one thing that helps you differentiate between a voter or a standard is that voters will tell you how specifically this is damaging to debaters, and like debate in like as a whole activity, right? This doesn't really do that. It talks about like just debaters specifically are learning less. Okay. Um. So there's also like paradigms that you have to read at the bottom. Um. how do I say this? Okay, so there's okay, okay. So there's you have to tell the judge how to evaluate the theory debate, right? Because like in um what is it called? In like contention debate, in substance debate, which is debate about the actual topic, we already have set rules. It's like, oh, you should vote for whoever has like, you know, the best weighing that tells you which impact is the biggest or which impact is the most important, and whoever has like the best links to that and their arguments didn't get refuted. We kind of know like how to judge like, you know, substance debate, but what we don't know is kind of like how should we judge like theory debate, right? So there's two things that you have to talk about. So the first is competing interest slash reasonability, and competing interest is often abbreviated as CI. This might sound really confusing, but it's really easy, right? So when we have when we're in debate, one person reads a case, a contention, and another person reads contention, and we debate about it, right? So the idea of competing interest is that when I read a theory shell, you should also be reading a theory shell in response, so that we can like duke it out, right? Like whose rule is better. So that's competing interest. Reasonability is just okay, if I defeat their argument, you should vote for me. It's kind of like a fiat, right? So like for example, if you thought about substance debate, if Af read a case and then Neg just refuted Af and say, okay, even though I don't have a case myself, as long as I destroy their arguments, they should vote for me. So that's what reasonability is, right? Competing interest is we should both read arguments, and if I win my argument and they lose their argument, then I should win. Reasonability is I can destroy their argument. There's no reason to vote for them. You should vote for me, right? And that's just how that's something that like people argue about a lot. Like, oh, should we have my opponents read an argument, or should they just see like if I lose my argument, does that make me lose? Okay. And the second one is RVI slash no RVIs. RVI stands for reverse voting issue. So one thing that debaters will do is sometimes they like read theory just to win the round, right? Like, okay, uh, like sometimes people read theory because it really does matter to them. Like, for example, if I have disclosed online, but you haven't disclosed, it really matters to me because you know my argument. I could lose because you prep me out, but I don't know your argument, right? That's kind of unfair to me. So people are reading these theory shows and they're like trying to make the other person lose because like it's the debate was already unfair to them starting even before the round, right? Um, what a reverse voting issue is that if the person who began reading theory, right, whoever like starts this argument about the rules of debate, if they lose their theory shell, they should lose the round, right? So if I say, okay, you should disclose, and then somehow the opponents like convince the judge that my argument is like bad for XYZ reasons and that like we should not disclose, does that mean that my opponent gets to win the round, right? Because they just like set a different rule. It's like, okay, sure, you set a different rule, but does that mean I lose the round? So for example, if I ran, like if I was the first one to bring up theory, I was like, okay, we should disclose. And then my opponents ran, we should not disclose. And then they won. Although they haven't disclosed, right? Obviously they wouldn't lose because I lost my shell. But if they say, oh, debaters shouldn't need to disclose, even though I disclosed, it's not like a bad thing to anyone, right? I was the one who chose to disclose, but I didn't necessarily violate their rule because they say debaters should have a choice whether or not they should disclose, right? Okay, I can disclose or I cannot disclose. Technically, I didn't violate your shell, so why should I lose the round, right? But the other argument about no reverse voting issues is that okay, like you shouldn't vote for my opponents just because they did the bare minimum, right? For example, if I read a theory cell saying, oh, um, my opponents should disclose, and they're like, actually we did disclose, then you're like, okay, that's fine, right? Then nobody should lose the round. um but with RBIs, what would happen is that I would lose the round because I brought up the theory shell and then I lost, so I accused them of something that they didn't actually do, right? And the argument for RBIs is that like, okay, well, you wasted like so much of this debate time accusing me of something I didn't even do, or like telling me to follow a rule that like we all agreed that was like that made no sense, right? So you're just like wasting everyone's time. So we should vote for whoever um didn't bring up the theory debate. Does that make sense to you guys? It was kind of like a long-winded explanation.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me know if you guys have any questions. Okay. So as kind of a review, let me show you guys a theory shell that I have. This one in here. Sorry, my computer's kind of slow. Okay, here is a theory shell I have. So, right, it's the theory shell. It can be called like whatever is the theory. So this is disclosure shell because I'm telling people I'm like debating about disclosure, right? So here's the interp. All debaters must disclose any positions and cases, including the links and impacts they've read on the 2020 to 2021 session disclosure form on Google Docs under their assigned names and at least 15 minutes before a round. So this would be like the interp, right? And this like disclosure form, why I say it's not on the wiki is because this was like at a debate camp. So they told everyone to disclose on this form instead of like on the wiki, right? So that's why I told everyone to disclose here. Violation, they didn't disclose / they disclosed incorrectly. So disclosing incorrectly could mean that they didn't like meet my interp that says like all links and impacts, right? So they disclosed incorrectly, and then I would add a screenshot of like the wiki or like this Google Forms and show that they didn't disclose. Here are the standards. So the first is reciprocity. My opponent can access my entire case, but I'm left in the dark. So they have like a better strategy than I will, right? So that's like kind of unfair to me. Quality of education, disclosing allows debaters to come up with more nuanced, researched objections to their opponent's evidence, causing highest quality warrant comparison. It also prevents debaters from reading bad arguments since they know their opponents will have answers. So this is kind of like, okay, so if you know my arguments and I know your arguments, we can have a better discussion because like I will be able to like research your arguments beforehand, right? Clash. The debate itself becomes better when you disclose because you aren't reading generic case terms that are applicable. You read things that actually directly interact with the links and impacts of the opponent's case. So there's more clash and a better debate happens. Something that happens a lot in debate is that like instead of responding to the opponent's case, what they'll do is they'll just give independent. They'll read like a fifth contention in rebuttal, right? Which is like kind of unfair, but like technically still allowed sometimes. It'll just give you another reason why the contention is bad instead of saying like why your argument about this argument being good is like not right, right? Instead of actually clashing with you, they just read another case in rebuttal, which like obviously doesn't create any clash because you're just like trying to outweigh them with like a bunch of arguments, right? This one is funny. This NDF standard. So Jeff Miller, who is the camp director, and all the camp directors have said it's super good for education too. So this is just like this is kind of like a funny one. This probably something you wouldn't see in real life, but like just because someone said it's good doesn't necessarily mean it's good. But because it's like at debate camp, if the debate people tell you to do it, you should probably do it. So these are like the things that directly right. So when we think of standards, these are things that directly come from the violation. Then voters is how do these standards impact the actual debate, right? Fairness. Debate is a competitive activity that requires fair play. They can prep out my case, but I have no idea what they're running, which is unfair for me, right? So this is just like, okay, well, they know what I have. I don't know what they have. Obviously, that's kind of unfair. Education, right? So education is the reason that schools fund debate and the only thing that we actually take from the debate when we leave debate in the end. Increased clash, which is what I was talking about right up here, will actually let teams argue with each other and debate, and also doing more research means more nuanced arguments and pushes us to the next level of critical thinking because it forces us to analytically compare the warrants behind our arguments and weigh them against each other. So this is the voter, right? So we see education and fairness. It's like the most common ones that you'll ever see. Probably one of the only ones that you'll ever see. And then these are kind of like the things that I talked about at the end, right? So prefer competing interps over reasonability. So you should make them also read another interp instead of just saying, okay, if they didn't violate it, I'm not going to vote against them, right? Over reasonability, because judge intervention is biased under reasonability. So reasonability is just like the judge kind of makes the decision, like, okay, did they actually violate the interp? Does your interp, like, is your rule actually good for debate? So the judge like can kind of decide on some things. Whereas like if they have a competing interpretation, they have their own argument, like it's more clear, like, you know, who is better. And then I didn't put RBIs here, but I probably should, like, no RBIs, right? So when you're the one reading theories, you don't want there to be a reverse voting issue. You don't want there to be RBI, because if you lose the theory, then the other guy wins, right? So you want there to be no RBI. So you don't want, like, even if you lose the theory debate, you don't, no RBIs means the other guy still can't win. And then the last one that wasn't really talked about is drop the debater. Something that's common in like paraphrasing theory and in disclosure theory is something people will just say, like, okay, you shouldn't drop me. You should just drop my argument, right? Like, oh, I only paraphrase this evidence. You can just drop it. Or like, oh, you know, I only didn't disclose this argument. I disclosed the other argument. So you should just drop the other arguments or the other evidence, right? So the idea is that you want to stop that. So you say drop the debater, not the argument, to help punish the abuse and set a norm of disclosure. So instead of just like allowing them to like get away with it by like just dropping their argument, you should like actually vote against them so that they know what they did is wrong. And like people are like, oh no, like I don't want to lose my future rounds, so they all like disclose, right? And this is like a theory shell, a complete theory shell. So yeah, let's get back to this. But okay, so generally you won't see, when you first in novice year, you won't see someone like read theory against you. Probably, most likely not. There can be some intense novices, I guess, but I'm just saying this because I think in the future there's this growing trend where public forum is becoming more and more like policy and LD, right? People are speaking faster because, like, when it was first created, it was just parents judging. But now, as there's like I think there's been 40 years of like public forum going on, right? Like the people who used to debate come back and judge. There's like a lot of coaches now. So now you have like people who actually understand debate who are judging public forum. And because of that, you can speak faster. They know the rules of debate. So it's becoming more and more like tech, right? So there's more and more judges who know what's going on. So they're more receptive to arguments like theory that wouldn't make, like, if you ran a theory shell in front of a parent, they'd be like, I don't understand. Why are we debating about the rules of debate when the resolution is like the US should legalize drugs, right? Generally, you won't see this at like local tournaments where there's a lot of parent judges, but at higher level, like Tournament of Champions, at national tournaments like Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, you will see this more commonly, and I think it's probably a growing trend. So that's why I'm saying this. But most people don't run them. You just have to like know about them, kind of, right? So you should know disclosure theory, which is you should disclose your arguments. So if you don't want to disclose your arguments, you should probably write up a theory show for that, because most coaches and tech judges really like when you disclose. Another one is paraphrasing. So you shouldn't paraphrase. You should use quotations for like all the evidence that you talk about, right? So that's the other one that you should know about. There are other like really weirdly specific ones. Like during COVID, there was one like debaters shouldn't sit in the same room because like you're gonna spread COVID. Like, you know, that's probably gonna go away. And like shoe theory, which is like debaters shouldn't wear shoes. You probably won't see that either. But yeah, this is just like just in case. Okay, so next we'll kind of quickly talk about critiques. It's not, this is like even lower chance of you seeing this. So like the chance of you seeing a theory shell at a national tournament is probably like 10 or 5%. Seeing a critique is like 5 to 1%, right? Of all the debates that you'll ever do. Wow, this is a great rendition. But a critique, as I've talked about before, is either identity based, or it's about the arguments that you've made or something that you've done, right? So you guys theory can be a theory shell, and it can be also a critique. So if you go in there and you say, hey, what's up, you guys, and there's like a girl in there, you know, that's kind of like, well, she's not a guy, she's like a girl, so why are you saying you guys? that can be a critique, right? Like you shouldn't have said that, and then you should drop the debater. And then the identity-based ones are like, I'm Black, you should vote for me because when I get success, more people like me see that I'm successful and they want to join debate and things like that. So in a critique, there's also a structure, right? Critiques are also commonly called Ks, you know, it's K. But there's parts there's 4 parts basically. The first is the link. The second is the impact. The third is the alternative. The fourth is like the role of the ballot / the role of the judge. It means the same thing, but let's go over this. So link, what is a link, right? So it's kind of like a theory shell in that you have like a general rule that you want them to follow. For example, we shouldn't say you guys when going into a round. Or second, you shouldn't run this kind of argument for XYZ reasons, right? So the link is kind of like the violation of the rule, right? So you have to prove that they violated the rule. So that's kind of like the link. How does the team link into the K? Well, the team said you guys, that's how they violated my K, and thus they've like done something bad, right? That's the link. The impact is, why is it bad? This is kind of like the contention part, or like the standards and the voters part of a theory shell, right? So this is like, okay, saying you guys is bad because it perpetuates like masculinity, it makes female debaters feel unsafe, it's like XYZ, and then people read like a bunch of evidence on it, much like a contention, right? And generally when you run Ks, there's like a higher threshold, so you do want a lot of evidence for your K. You can't just like logic it the way that you can logic theory shells, because theory shells are just like logical debates about what debate rules should be, whereas Ks are like arguing that something is good or bad, which generally you probably need evidence for. And then you always need, this is also a really important part, which is unique from contentions or from like theory shows. This is the alternative. So what should we do instead? So basically, this is like, okay, for you guys theory, right? Like we shouldn't say you guys. The alternative is to not say you guys, right? While this seems like kind of intuitive, okay, just don't violate the rule. There are some things that like don't have alternatives, right? So for example, if you say like, oh, we shouldn't use like research from Western authors, like, you know, from the West, because we're debating about like Russia, and like Western authors are always super biased, so like it's super bad to use Western authors. Well, is there an alternative for that, right? Like some people, you might just like, you could probably say something like, okay, well, is there really an alternative? Because I can only read English, and like Google Translate probably wouldn't translate like articles from other countries that well, right? So like even if I tried to use like a China perspective or a Russia perspective, I can't read those, so there's not really alternative, right? And this alternative is what the team that is running the K usually will do, right? So for example, you guys, right, they would say like, okay, well, we're not going to say that, and that would be the alternative. Or, oh, we would not read any evidence that is from Western authors. That is the alternative, right? And when you're doing a K, you cannot violate your own K, just like you cannot violate your own theory shell, right? For example, if you read you guys theory on your opponents and then you like call everyone you guys, you just broke your own rule, and that's kind of like, you look like a clown, right? And if you like, for example, say to other people, okay, you can't read Western authors, and then you read a Western author when you're like doing, like when you're making the evidence for your K, you're also going to violate it. And then it's kind of like, okay, well then what's the point of you running this K, right? And then this is role of the ballot, or it's also called framework or role of the judge. All means the same thing. It's like, why do I care about this critique? Why should the judge vote for it? So it's much like a voter in a theory shell. So it's, for example, role a role of the ballot example would be like, okay, the role of the ballot is, so what we call when a judge votes, we call it a ballot, right? Like when you're voting for someone, right? And role of the ballot just means what should the judge be doing. in this debate, what should they be judging the debate on? So a lot of the time, people will say, okay, the role of the ballot is to make debate a safe space and to ensure that like everyone like has it's like fair and everyone can be successful in debate, right? So when people say like, for example, if I was running you guys theory, I'd be like, okay, well, you can't say you guys because it makes people feel unsafe. And then my role of the ballot would be judges need to make sure that debaters feel safe. So when someone is doing something that makes debate unsafe, you should vote against them. So that's the role of the ballot, right? There's also like a role of the ballot. Judges should vote for whoever is the most educational. Judges should vote for like XYZ, XYZ. So there's like a lot of different role of the ballots, right? Framework is kind of different. It's kind of like how should you judge the round? You can think of it kind of as like weighing. So this gets more complicated, but you can say like the framework of the round is to judge who has like the most unbiased arguments, because when we're biased it leads to like war or something. And then so you would say like, okay, we have the most unbiased arguments because we look at like Eastern authors, not just like biased Western authors or something like that, right? Okay. So I'm not explaining this really well, but does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Well, that is today's lecture. I know it might have been a little confusing, but if you go to debate camp in the future and you guys actually do debate, they'll probably explain this a lot better than I will. This is just like a heads up in case anyone ever runs against you. Actually, one last thing, let's talk about how you can argue against critiques. So I kind of like talked about like theory shows, right? So actually, let's go back to theory shows. So first, when we're looking at a theory show, right, we have interp violation. So interp, right? Um, the way that you argue a theory show can be interp. Okay, your interp is bad because it's not specific enough. Like a debaters must not wear shoes. Okay, I'm not gonna wear shoes at home, but I'm wearing shoes right now. Like you didn't tell me when I can't wear shoes, right? So they get around the violation. You can also argue against the violation. You can just be like, no, your screenshot was at like 3:26. Like, you know, I had like until 3:28 to actually disclose. So you can like argue against the violation, or you could say like, oh, I've never done that. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Although this isn't really like, because usually people have like good evidence on you. This isn't really something that will be argued, but you can try. The next is standards. So you can like argue when you're either reading a competing interp or you're just arguing against them. You can either say, oh, my standards are more important than your standards, because like you might say evidence ethics, I might say like time skew is more important, right? And you give reasons. You can also like kind of de-link it, quote unquote, from like the standards to the voters. So for example, like, okay, just because we have bad evidence ethics doesn't mean that the round is unfair for XYZ reasons. Or you can say like, okay, like your rule doesn't actually solve for anything, right? Like, so another thing that a lot of people do is that like, sure, even if we followed your rule about like disclosing evidence ethics wouldn't get better because like people can just, you know, like edit the article or like whatever, like they do XYZ to make disclosing like really hard or bad, right? um so it's like also your interpretation can't solve for like the problems in debate. That's another reason, that's another way we can attack standards. Voters, you basically just say like, okay, your standards don't link to your voters for XYZ, or why my voters are more important than your voters, or why your voters don't matter, right? Like, oh, education doesn't matter because like debate is just a game. We're not like coming here to get educated. We're coming here to like win trophies, right? Like nobody cares about the education aspect. You can say stuff like that. Okay, and then on K's, we have link, impact, alt. So you can attack the link, right? Once again, you can think of this as a violation. You can say like, no, I didn't actually like violate the K. Like I didn't actually do anything bad. I didn't meet your link. So like I didn't actually impact. It doesn't link to the impact, right? So nothing actually happened. You can talk about the impact. You can like argue against the content, like the critique itself. Like say, oh, saying you guys isn't that bad because it's said outside of debate rounds anyways. Like everyone's going to say this. It doesn't actually mean like, you know, there's no girls here. It's just like we generalize like guys to all humans just the way that we say like mankind for all humans. Like obviously we know there's women, there's no real impact, stuff like that, right? For all, you can say there's no alternative. So if they say something like, oh, you can't use Western authors, you'll be like, okay, there's no alternative because I can't actually read in Russian or Chinese or something like the east side of the world, right? So there's actually no alternative. There's no way we can solve for this problem. So there's no reason why we should like even evaluate your critique. And you can also argue against the role of the ballot or the role of the judge or even the framework. You can be like, okay, the role of the judge is just to vote for whoever debates the topic the best, right? The judge is not supposed to be here to like be a referee, like, oh, did you like violate the rules, or like are you making people feel safe, or like change the rules of the debate. All the judge does is like see if you debated well and whoever wins the debate. Like you can argue things like that. And you can also argue against their framework with your own framework or your own role of the ballot. Yeah, like, but at every point you can kind of attack their arguments. And when you attack the impact, right, which is kind of like the flesh of the critique, where they argue XYZ is good or bad and they give evidence for it, you can attack it in the same way that you would attack any contention, right? You can talk about a linked turn, like, oh, like actually saying you guys is good for debate for XYZ. You can like you can do like a non-unique, right? Like, okay, even if I stop saying you guys, like other people will say you guys, even if the judge votes against me, right? That's non-unique. You can do impact mitigation, impact turns, a lot of the same things that you can do in a substance debate, you can also do in a critique. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on this? Okay. I will say nobody has any questions. I won't keep you guys any longer, so you guys are free to go. And thank you for coming to today's meeting. Sorry, I haven't like held any in like 3 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
You.